Hello, IB Bio students. So today we are going to go over 8.3 photosynthesis. Last time we looked at the structure of the chloroplast. Today we're going to look at the photosynthesis equation and try to make some sense out of the equation and what we're seeing. So here's the understanding, which is light-dependent reactions take place in the intermembrane space of the thylakoids. Remember, thylakoids are those quarters, right, inside the chloroplast. And light-independent reactions take place in the stoma, which is the cytoplasm inside the chloroplast. So the purpose of photosynthesis is to synthesize organic molecules like glucose. Glucose is not the only molecule that's made in photosynthesis. You might be surprised, but the main example that we always use is glucose. And that organic molecule is made from inorganic molecules like carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight. This process requires a photosynthetic pigment that is found in the chloroplast. This pigment is called chlorophyll. It's green because it's able to absorb light at all wavelengths except for green. So that's what bounces back and what we can see. And we know that this photosynthetic pigment is present in organisms like plants and some bacteria. And also, it should be mentioned, some protists like Euglena. So what happens in this specialized organelle called the chloroplast? Well, this photosynthetic equation happens there. And I always like to do this to kind of simplify the process. And I say that when carbon dioxide, through various processes, various metabolic reactions, is eventually fixated or converted into glucose, I call that the light independent reaction. I'm going to write that here. And when water splits through the process of photolysis and it releases oxygen, this is part of the light dependent reaction. So the difference between the two is light dependent requires light and light independent does not use light. Now, you might be wondering, wait a minute, why does this have 12 molecules of water and this have 6 molecules of water? This is not usually how you've learned the photosynthetic equation. Well, just keep in mind that the photosynthetic equation that you usually see in books is the net version of photosynthesis that appears like this, right? So they don't really show you these byproducts of water that are used up again within the process of photosynthesis. But I like how this page shows you the overall growth equation of photosynthesis, because not all textbooks show you this because it could be a little bit confusing. And it shows you that 6 molecules of water are also a byproduct of photosynthesis. So that's new. All right, so moving right along. So the 2 steps of photosynthesis, and I just mentioned that, are the light-dependent and the light-independent reactions. So we're going to look at these 2 processes in a little more detail, in a lot more detail, actually. So here's just an overview of the process, and I really like how these diagrams make the process look very simple. So here we have the light-independent reaction, so let's start with this one. Now, the light-independent reaction needs light, of course, right? It's called light-dependent for that reason. And the light energy that comes from the sun is absorbed by chlorophyll, the photosynthetic pigment. And that photosynthetic pigment, what it does, it releases energized electrons. So remember that in cellular respiration, we learned that electrons could carry energy. So once these energized electrons are released, they can be carried by carrier molecules like NADPH, and we'll see that in just a moment. So here we see light energy hitting the chlorophyll. When that happens, the chlorophyll releases electrons in the form of chemical energy, and these electrons carry high energy. These electrons are donated to carrier molecules. So NADP plus is the carrier molecule in photosynthesis. NADP plus gets reduced to NADPH when it picks up that energy electron. And also this chemical energy can be stored in the form of ATP. So then that means that ADP gets phosphorylated and you form the molecule of ATP alongside. Okay. Now, what happens to the water? Let's move a little bit here. What happens to the water? The electrons that the chlorophyll molecule lost are replaced by water because this water molecule splits. And this is the process known as photolysis. And when the water molecule splits, it produces oxygen and hydrogen. So here we see the oxygen, and here we see the hydrogen, and this is more like hydrogen ions that are also picked up by NADPH, which is the carrier molecule. So where does this happen? This happens in the intermembrane space of the thylakoids. And remember that the thylakoids were these little quarter-looking structures inside the chloroplast. They would stack up in the form of a grana. So it's in the intermembrane space, because these have a double membrane, that the light-dependent reaction happens. Now what's going to happen to this oxygen? It's going to diffuse out of the chloroplast, and it's going to diffuse out of the plants. And that's where we get the oxygen that we breathe. And what's going to happen to the rest? Well, remember that the high energy electrons were picked up by the taxis of photosynthesis, which is now a reduced NADPH, and also that chemical energy in the form of ATP is now going to be involved in what we call the light independent reaction. And again, it's called independent of light because no light is needed to drive these reactions. So what happens afterwards? So now you have the ATP and the hydrogen electron carriers in the form of the reduced NADPH, and they're going to play a role in these light independent reactions. So when these hydrogen electron carriers are combined with carbon dioxide, which is another reactant in photosynthesis, and this carbon dioxide diffused into the chloroplast, it's small enough to do so, it's going to form complex organic compounds, which we call carbohydrates. And we know that glucose happens to be the main organic compound in photosynthesis. So we see here that carbon dioxide, once it gets diffused, it gets fixed. And we're going to study this process in more detail when we look at the light independent reactions. But this carbon fixation is part of what we call the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle. So this is a whole process here that involves the carbon dioxide, the electron carriers, and it requires ATP to run it. So through this carbon fixation process, carbon dioxide turns into glucose or other organic compounds. Now, where does all of this happen? The light independent reactions happen in the stroma of the chloroplast, which is the fluid filled interior of the chloroplast. So we are going to spend some time looking at more detail in the light dependent and light independent reactions. But this is a quick overview of how photosynthesis happens.